Hey there, YouTubers, philosophers. I'm wearing my more ceremonial Stetson, and yes, there is kind of a humorous halo effect with the light behind me, which I trust the wide brim to block. And I kind of think of Richard Stallman when I do this because he has his famous lecture format where he talks about open source versus free open, whatever. And then comes the VI versus Emacs, where he makes fun in a way of religious wars, but a lot of religious wars in computer science, which in computer practice, which in turn makes fun of religious wars. Anyway, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I should change the subject here. My main show and tell, by the way, and this is kind of a wandering talk as usual, having just gone to a wanderers gathering. I think of wanderers as giving me license to wander freely, but within a pinball machine of topics. I keep hitting the same points. Like Wittgenstein, I keep coming back to. And in the last couple days, I've just reread Culture and Value. I just read it cover to cover now. It's a very thin book, and half of it's in his native German on one side, and Peter Winch's translation on the other. So, and again, it's kind of only half the length if you're just going to read the English only, which is my tendency. I glance over at the German, but my German sucks. I don't know German, and I say things like, "Wow, we don't have that letter," or "Look at all those capitals or capital letters." Right? German comes across as being very capitalized. On that topic, seeing according to an interpretation, it's so deep. When can you look at English if you speak it or read it? If you read English, can you look at it and will yourself to not understand it at all, to look as alien to you as a language that you don't know? I really can't do that. Turning it upside down, maybe, but helps. But just staring at English and forcing myself not to be able to understand it, I can't do that. So the perceptual inducement to see a certain way, once it's done, you can't undo it sometimes. That's when they say things like, you can't unsee this or you can't unread this. There's something big behind that. Now, as far as culture and value, Wittgenstein's very informally conversational here, as if with good friends. He's like sitting around shooting the breeze, but he's not trying to be shallow when I say that. He's still doing his investigations, and you might miss sometimes his main point, which is he's positioning himself vis a vis all these other luminaries. And when I say all these, I mean a small number, some of whom I don't know. So he talks about Shakespeare, who he doesn't really get, and he's thinking Shakespeare's one of a kind. He thinks a lot about how context matters, and you maybe can't compare A to B because the backgrounds are completely different. And he thinks his own philosophy might be like that. You can't really compare it to anything prior because he's in a new kind of what's happening in the world is so different now. So it takes a different kind of philosophy. You can see that's on his mind. He's also very musically minded. He talks about how he kind of grinds his teeth or taps his teeth, and he's always fantasizing about music, little passages, and he's reading into them quite deeply and seeing irony and all this stuff. And Beethoven invented irony in music, and then Wagner also brought it in, but in an earthly way, and all. Whereas Beethoven's cosmic and blah blah. This kind of stuff, I don't think in those ways. Like I'm not humming little tunes to myself and doing a lot of analysis and investigation the way he is, but he clearly wants us to see his own writing and really to understand language in general. It's not about how we just approach his language, but language in general has such musical aspects, timing, rhythm. It goes on and on. How do we get irony into language at all? What's the music of that? Like, forget about music. What about just talking? Where does all this nuance come from? And that's the thing. Wittgenstein's very interested in nuance, so much so that he sees himself as not in the scientific enterprise, because science is not that interested in nuance. It wants direct facts, literal meanings, blah, blah. So, on that vein, I'm going to try jumping over to my viewing history. Sometimes I surf back through McKenna, Terrence. Never met him. Um, Used to be very annoyed by him and his voice and everything about him, but now he's just part of the repertoire of things I'll occasionally listen to. And then I went through King Crocoduck. Uh, Excellent videos here, I thought, just explaining quantum mechanics. And I was going towards episode 3 and found out more of the scope of his thinking. And he's attacking or defending, as you want to say. Um, in a way, he sees things the way I do, in that he sees the C.P. Snow chasm. He puts a picture of C.P. Snow's book cover up and talks about, like, now that the humanities have fallen. Now, this is not my narrative, but more his. Now that the path side has fallen to postmodernism, now they're storming the bridge and they're planning to take over STEM as well. And it's kind of like, we must repulse this. We must defend the bastion, STEM, against this scourge that's coming across the drawbridge, if there's a drawbridge. Somewhere he mentions get something about a moat. I don't know. Now I do speak in that imagery sometimes of sort of gathering steam on the STEM side, and then coming over, or excuse me, on the path side in the humanities, gathering steam, values, having values, and then coming over the bridge into STEM with values. And like Bucky Fuller, who I'm a champion of his stuff a lot of the time, he had values, right? Like, he was really concerned about inequality for women. And he kind of thought if the US didn't have the backbone to pass the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, this was back in the 80s, right? If that didn't happen, that was another sign that the US was fading because it didn't have that kind of strength. And by the end of his life, he's seeing it as gone, really faded out. But, how you see things again, it's like when I see Chinese now and don't read it, it looks very different than, say, 20 years from now when I've studied it really hard and I can read it now. Let's pretend, right? So these perceptual changes, whether you see nation states or not, it's not an intellectual thing sometimes. Just like climate change has changed how people think about the world, it's much more of a blue dot with gas problems, right? And that people would never go around with that in their head as anything to be concerned about in Wittgenstein's childhood, right? People weren't worried about the gas mix of the atmosphere. So our world has changed, right? So finally, what we talked about at Wanderers, I'm going to phase out at that. In other words, my last 3 twists in this windy trail are going to be like what came up at Wanderers. Not the sum of 3 cubes, actually. That's been a story. And in Codesters, I wanted to make it clear that the calculator of tomorrow can actually compute these like gigantic third powers, right? They found 3 third powers that when you add them up give 42. And they've been working on getting all the double digit numbers. Like 33 was a holdout, 42's been a big holdout, and it just fell to some giant supercomputer kind of brute force, I'm sure very clever algorithm solutions. After some weeks of running, they finally got the answer. It's kind of like, factoring a prime number. It's not necessarily easy. The whole point is the reason cryptography is secure is we can't afford to hire MIT and all these other places to devote their supercomputers to these problems at the drop of a hat, because you want to find out, who's said what to who is about who's really whose boyfriend or whatever. Like, gossip does not rise to the occasion. And I think a lot of that is what there's a proudness or about science being value free or objective. Sometimes that's taken as a great thing, and that's why it's so worthy. But other times it's like, wait a minute, aren't values something we want to have? Don't we respect medicine, medical engineering? There's a borderline. Don't we expect doctors to be about the health of people? What if at World War II time, when physicists told each other they were probably developing an atomic bomb on the other side, so we have to do it? What if it was like only a Dr. Evil would be doing that? No whole group would be that pathological. Physicists as a whole are like doctors. They don't do things like that. They root out people like that and disbar them. They defrock them. So of course the Germans aren't working on an atom bomb. They wouldn't. They have too much self-pride in their profession as physicists to do anything like that. Well, of course that's not the world we live in at all. It wasn't then. It isn't now. So the question is that a case where values? Are we proud that physics has no values in that sense? That the mass murder of all human beings, if we have to, we have to, right? It's like somebody gave us the order, and we're not here to question the political sphere. We're just here to come up with better weapons. What if physicists were to have a code of conduct that says we cannot work on these kind of projects? Is that something that we're trying to fight really hard, or what? I mean, I'm just asking. Okay. Fuller also dedicated his Grunch of Giants to three women, I should say. So Joe, who owns this beautiful work of art place and has put a huge effort into making it a wonderful country place, a country estate with trees, beautifully planted gardens, all kinds of stuff. So we talked a lot at the beginning about chirality, or chirality actually. Chirality, handedness. Handedness in the sense of left and right handed and so forth. And in chemistry, we get into isomers there. Like left and right make a difference. There's a way that it's not symmetrical in the universe, right? And just in individual cases, like he's a retired psychiatrist, and he was aware of a case where one antidepressant that had both left and right isomers in it had worse side effects than one that had been purged of one or the other isomer. I think all left-handed isomers had less bad side effects, at least in his opinion. And not just in his opinion, I would say there were studies that back that up. It's not just, psychiatrists probably subject to placebo effect in a way too, and that if the advertising is good enough, they'll believe, what they're told about how this has less side effects. But I think there would be some objective studies, maybe paid for by the drug company, though we don't know. It's hard to track sometimes who's paying for science. And I think that's worth talking about. In other words, I don't like it when science circles the wagons against what I would consider minor foes. In my book, like the biblical literalists don't ever amount to much of a threat. I don't see them as on the verge of winning any battles. I think it's right, on the other hand, or useful to critique social Darwinism, eugenics, and so on, to like dismiss all that history and say, well, that's just the pathetic weapon of the biblical literalists, is not to take it seriously enough as a threat, right? Like social Darwinism, I see, is just as much a threat if there were no biblical literalists out there, right? And so I think science needs to have values and police itself, and codes of conduct are not something we should eschew, right? And when I say we, I don't know, maybe you don't think of me as a scientist, nor do you think of Bucky Fuller as a scientist. And Applewhite too, he pushed Fuller in the direction of like Nature magazine. That's where he wanted Fuller to make relationships, is in the real science, hard sciences somehow. And the virology thing looked promising. Then came Buckminster Fullerene, right? All of that was happiness for Applewhite. But he was not a big fan of like some of the other sides to Fuller's personality as much. And I think one can seize on those as the American transcendentalist that Fuller was, is, more appealing, I think, to say Kiyoshi Kuramiya, who worked with him on Critical Path and Grunch of Giants also. Anyway, where Fuller fits into the dialogue among philosophers is something I talk about. So I'm going to wind up with that chirality thread and this 42 thing. Chirality or chirality, one of my most popular essays on Medium, is about the dangers of overlooking left-handed versus right-handed and going straight to congruence. You see, congruence is an inadequate filter against things that are different, only handed difference. Like if you play Tetris and you need a left-handed L shape and you get a right one, there's no way in that game to flip it over. It really makes a big difference. But they're congruent. And what the people who want you to overlook the difference is going to say things like, well, you could flip it over on a table. Like if it was cut out of paper, you could flip it over. There's always a higher dimension where they're the same. So the invocation of a higher dimension is characteristic of the language game of congruence. And if you say it's chirality matters, then left versus right matters, then in a sense you're stuck in a lower dimension in your thinking. And that means people can look down on you because you're in a lower dimension, right? Now on the 42 thing, this is, see, if you don't have those associations from reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and have all these funny jokes or not funny jokes where the answer is 42, right? Because in that book, the answer to what is the meaning of the universe or something, it came out as 42, very meaningless, right? And that was the whole point. That was the humor, right? That there was an answer, but it was something we could do nothing with, 42. But there is something we can work on, which is what sum of 3 numbers to the third power gives us 42. And since third powers can easily be negative, because negative times negative times negative is negative, you can go really, really big with 2 of them and then subtract, right? So this is what are called the 3 cubes that add up to 42. And I got that going on Codesters just to show that Codesters can do this. The calculator of tomorrow can do this, right? Now, we didn't really bring this up at Wanderers. I didn't stick to my agenda of only talking about what we talked about at Wanderers. We didn't talk about this, but we did have a meandering conversation like this. So this is illustrative of what Wanderers is like in my book. Beautiful day, beautiful day. All right, so I would say Crocoduck, I think he's kind of making fun of the duck rabbit, the Wittgenstein Crocoduck, is doing interesting work, and I think we should continue with these debates. I think it's important that we talk about values and stem versus path and what is their integration. And I also pointed out that these 3 third power numbers could just as well be tetrahedrons. If you know Martian math, anything with an edge of n to the third power can just be shown as the tetrahedron, the regular tetrahedron with edges n. That's a consistent view, and Fuller made the most of that. That was his mark. He hung his hat on that peg, you could say. And it did get him some nice whole number volumes that we're not used to sharing with kids. It's not part of our curriculum. So I harp on that and the duck rabbit, for me, the Wittgenstein duck rabbit fits here too. Because I think seeing that you could do that, use a tetrahedron instead of a cube, that's the kind of thing that Wittgenstein's interested in. An aesthetic change, you might say. It's a different way of looking. It's a nuance. Maybe too nuanced to be of interest to real math. That's what it seems like. It's like, who cares, right? So what? You could say that's 3 tetrahedrons. What's the negative mean anyway? Well, it's just you add 2 and subtract the third, whatever. Okay, well, that was my wandering talk for today. Enjoy.